Hello, how is everybody doing today? We are back for another Bible story reading. We've been going through the story of the different stories in the book of Daniel, and right now we are on chapter 6. If you are joining one of these story readings for the first time, welcome. We go through the different stories of the Bible for people who don't know what the stories are or who just want a refresher on what they are. Today we are going to start with the story of Daniel in the lion's den. And no doubt you have heard something about this story. Maybe you have heard bits and pieces of it, but not the whole thing. We're going to do the whole thing today. Let's see if I can get some more light here. There we go. It's getting kind of dark. We left off where Daniel had read the handwriting that was on the wall at the feast that Belshazzar had given. And if you remember, the writing on the wall basically said, well, sorry, Belshazzar, but you messed up by having a party using all of the goods that came out of the house of the Lord's temple that you stole. So his life was required of him, and that very night the Chaldeans came in, and Belshazzar was killed, and then Darius the Mede took over. So now we start with chapter 6. Darius decided to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, stationed throughout the realm, and over them 3 administrators, including Daniel. These satraps would be accountable to them, so that the king would not be defrauded. Daniel distinguished himself above the administrators and satraps because he had an extraordinary spirit. So the king planned to set him over the whole realm. The administrators and satraps, therefore, kept trying to find a charge against Daniel regarding the kingdom, but they could find no charge or corruption, for he was trustworthy, and no negligence or corruption was found in him. Then these men said, "We will never find any charge against this Daniel unless we find something against him concerning the law of God." So the administrators and satraps went together to the king and said to him, "May King Darius live forever." All the administrators of the kingdom, the prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have agreed that the king should be established in ordinance and enforce an edict that for 30 days anyone who petitions any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den. Therefore, your majesty, establish the edict and sign the document so that as a law of the Medes and Persians it is irrevocable and cannot be changed. So King Darius signed the written edict. When Daniel learned that the document had been signed, he went into his house. The windows in its upstairs room were open towards Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he got down on his knees, prayed, and gave thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel petitioning and imploring his God. So they approached the king and asked about his edict. "Didn't you sign an edict that for 30 days any person who petitioned any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den?" The king answered, "As a law of the Medes and Persians, the order stands and is irrevocable." Then they replied to the king, "Daniel, one of the Judean exiles, has ignored you, the king, and the edict you signed, for he prays 3 times a day." As soon as the king heard this, he was very displeased. He set his mind on rescuing Daniel and made every effort until sundown to deliver him. Then these men went together to the king and said, "You know, your majesty, that it is a law of the Medes and the Persians that no edict or ordinance the king establishes can be changed." So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you continually serve, rescue you." A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing in regard to Daniel could be changed. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and he could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he reached the den, he cried out in anguish to Daniel, "Daniel, servant of the living God," the king said, "has your God, whom you continually serve, been able to rescue you from the lions?" Then Daniel spoke with the king. "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth, and they have not harmed me, for I was found innocent before him, and also before you, your majesty. I have not done harm." The king was overjoyed and gave orders to take Daniel out of the den. When Daniel was brought up from the den, he was found to be unharmed, for he trusted in his God. The king then gave the command, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and thrown into the lion's den. They, their children, and their wives. They had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Then King Darius wrote to those of every people, nation, and language who lived in the whole earth, "May your prosperity abound. I issue a decree that in all my royal dominion people must tremble in fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and his dominion has no end. He rescues and delivers. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. For he has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus and Persian. Wow, that's the story of Daniel in the lion's den. There are three ways that we look at these verses when we read them, these stories. Well, we have to know what it says. What does it say? We have to read the words on the page to know that. What was it saying to the people of the time? What was the history? What was the culture? And what, if anything, is it saying to us today? Well, this is such a fascinating story. And before we unpack it, I want to dispel one myth or misconception that people have of this story. They think when they hear the story of King Darius throwing Daniel into the lion's den that the king was angry with Daniel, but that is not true. The king was not angry with Daniel. He was angry at the men who set Daniel up. So let's go ahead and unpack this. King Darius has appointed basically managers. You think of several different businesses that might have, let's think of a corporation where you have the executive. He's the top dog in the corporation. And then you might have the vice president or managers that fall underneath him. Well, the king had set up many managers for different realms, different little towns, if you will. And in those, he had set up 3 overseers that were like districts. So let's say we have 3 different districts. This would be the head of one district, the head of a second district, and the head of another district. But Daniel was going to be given the position of executive, if you will. He would have been over the districts. He would have been over all of the other managers. He would have been the top dog. And it was his job to give an account to the king of everything that was going on in these realms, financially and otherwise. Out of their jealousy, some of these other appointed people thought, how can we get rid of him? They were very jealous of Daniel because Daniel just kept getting promoted, and Daniel was well respected by King Darius. So they wondered how they could find fault with him, and they tried. They looked to see if he was corrupt. Maybe he was taking bribes on the side or something, but they found no corruption whatsoever. They knew that the only way to trap him was to involve his relationship with God somehow. They wanted to find fault with his relationship with God. More than likely, they could find no fault in how Daniel related to God. So they sneakily went to the king and they're like, "Hey, king, you're so wonderful." So here they are appeasing King Darius with flattery. "You're so wonderful. You're so awesome. You know what you should do? You should make this law for 30 days that says that Nobody can pray to another god or ask advice or anything from another man. They all have to come to you. And King Darius is like, oh, thanks for the flattery. That sounds good. Yeah, I'm going to sign an edict. What you have to remember is that once the king did that, based on the Mede law, he was not allowed to undo that. Once it was a decree, once it was an edict, he couldn't say, oh, wait, I changed my mind. He could not do that. That was against their law. And these people knew it. So the king signs this into law for 30 days. These guys know that Daniel will not stop petitioning his God because he had a good relationship with God. Oh, Daniel learns about the document that was signed, saying that everybody had to go to the king instead of their God, and he disregards it. He disregards the decree and he goes home and he prays just like he always did 3 times a day, looking out towards Jerusalem. Well, these guys catch him. They see him praying through his window because his window was open. And they go to King Darius. They're like, you signed that law. Now Daniel's going to have to get thrown in the lion's den. Well, when the king heard this, he was mortified. I imagine at that point he realized that he had just gotten set up by these guys, that they took advantage of that law to get rid of Daniel, whom he had great respect and care for. Darius actually cared for Daniel. So much so he tried to get out of it, and they're like, no, you can't do that. You signed the law. You have to follow through with it. So they bring Daniel. He gets thrown into the lion's den. The king seals the den closed. But the king goes back to his room at the palace, and he locks himself in, and he fasts all night long. He didn't sleep at all that night. He was worried about Daniel. And no doubt he was probably feeling very embarrassed, maybe, ashamed. We don't know. It doesn't say that. But he was very upset that this happened to Daniel. And it happened because he got tricked. So he's fasting for Daniel. He's on Daniel's side. There was a part of Darius that knew that Daniel's God was capable of saving him from the mouth of the lions. So the next morning, he rushes to, it says the first light of dawn, so as soon as the sun comes up, he rushes over to the lion's den. He gets the rock moved, and he says, Daniel, are you in there? Are you okay? Has your God delivered you? Daniel responds, and he says, yes, my God has delivered me. I'm okay. The king was overjoyed. It says he was overjoyed. Well, think about how happy you would be, too, if you thought somebody was going to be put to death, and you've been just hoping they wouldn't be, and praying and asking God to deliver them, and then sure enough, they get delivered. So he's so excited that he has the people who brought the charges up against Daniel thrown in there. Not just them, their wives, their children, their entire families. They all get thrown in there. And before they even hit the bottom of the lion's den, the lions crushed their bones, their body, and killed them all. Well, out of this, Darius gives honor to God, and he praises the God. He says he is the living God who endures forever, and he rescues and delivers. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth. This served as a testimony of Daniel's God, the power of God, how almighty God is, and how he honors the people who honor him. Which leads us to the third thing that we look at. What, if anything, is this saying to us today? Well, I think it says exactly that. God will honor those who honor him. There are times in our lives where we may be called upon to have to stand for what is right, even when it seems to go against law. Right now, there are some things happening in this world that are requiring people to no longer do law-wise, do what God has commanded them to do, but we answer to a higher authority and we will be taken care of. It doesn't mean that bad things don't happen to good people, because sometimes they do. But we have a God who is just as powerful today as he was back then. He never changes. He is consistent. And the things that happen in this world can only serve to be a testimony to that power of God. This is just a fantastic story. Well, I hope you learned something today. Maybe you didn't know that the king was never angry at Daniel. That wasn't why he threw him into the lion's den. Maybe you had this vision of this vicious king throwing Daniel into the lion's den, and that that was the case, but that wasn't the case. So I hope you learned something today, and I look forward to us moving on to the next stories that we're going to tackle. Have a great day, and God bless you.